Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my MSI 2025 Semifinals overview and analysis video. It's the lower bracket finals, if you technically want to call it that. I'm calling it the semifinals because the winner of this makes the finals, and that just sounds a little bit cooler in my head, but whatever you want to call it, it's up to you. This is our final matchup before the grand finals of the midseason invitational, and that means there's a lot on the line, not only because obviously both of these teams want to make the finals, but I think the narratives kind of surrounding these two regions right now are going to be put to the test here today, and I'm excited to see how it goes. If you are excited as well, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect to happen in this series? Did it live up to your expectations? Were you surprised by the outcome? I'm curious to know your thoughts and opinions down there. Of course, I'll go over my, predictions, my anticipations going into this series, what I talked about in yesterday's video when, of course, we previewed it at the end of the bracket stage, but I'm excited to get into the actual analysis itself. So let's go ahead and get into it. If you are new here to the channel, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be looking at the bracket, but there's only one more series left to preview at the end of this, the finals of MSI. No matter what, it's going to be a rematch from some point at this tournament, as Gen G has taken on both of the competitors that will be competing today, but Gen G was able to overcome both of those challenges, and I definitely think both of these teams could definitely give them a run for their money. All of those series went 5, and so I'm really excited to see how things go. Anybody who's left in the tournament can absolutely still win it, and I am excited to get into it. So let's get into our coverage, our preview, and of course, as you can see on your screen, it was a matchup between the number 2 seed from the LCK in T1 and the number 1 seed from the LPL in anyone's Legend. These two teams are coming from very different avenues, I would say, across this year, but for the most part, they've been in pretty similar situations at this tournament in particular, which is to say they've had a pretty easy time getting through a lot of the teams that aren't quite as good as them. T1 struggled a bit more in round number 1 with the Oysters, but anyone's Legend, pretty handily took care of FlyQuest. I think generally speaking, those teams are around the same skill level. I know there's going to be a lot of people who debate one team over the other, but at the end of the day, they're going to be close in terms of skill level, in terms of what they are production-wise, and T1 obviously goes on to sweep Billy Gaming in the next round. Anyone's Legend goes on to just barely get knocked down by Gen G in round number 2 because they got just about the worst possible draw they could get. And then Anyone's Legend kind of sweeps through the lower part of the bracket, with them being able to take down the Oysters in 4 games, not even needing to go to a game 5 against them, and then obviously sweeping Billy Gaming, who just was not the competition that we thought they were going to be at this tournament. T1, however, of course, only going on to winners finals after that round 2 matchup, and very narrowly losing in a very close game number 5, a back-and-forth series where both of those teams played very well. T1 just wasn't really able to hold on to the big lead that they were able to generate at the beginning of game 5, and they end up falling down to this matchup in the lower bracket. They do not want to let that be their, last remaining memory of what it was like going up against Chovy and Gen G at this tournament. They want to be able to get back to facing their rivals, their regional rivals, in the finals themselves. So what do each of these teams have going for them in terms of the preview and in terms of the matchup? Well, I think this matchup is very interesting because on paper, especially if you're taking into account everything we've seen this year, Anyone's Legend might look like the better team. I think there's a strong argument that they have the best player in this series, that being Tarzan right now, who's just on an absolute warpath. This guy has been unreal so far in 2025. I've been a long-time Tarzan defender. In fact, LPL fans are probably very tired of hearing me talk about this guy because when he was on LNG in 2023, even going back to 2022, everybody was shitting on him all the time. There were fans waiting outside the arena to berate him after he would lose games for LNG, and I was constantly sitting there talking about how he was getting scapegoated. They eventually let him go. Midway through last year, he gets picked up by Weibo Gaming, elevates them to be good enough to make the semifinals of Worlds, and now obviously is elevating Anyone's Legend. Finally achieved his overall dream of winning a domestic title. It took him so long to actually be the champion of a region, but he wins the LPL this past split with Anyone's Legend. He looks great so far at this tournament. I think you could argue that he's maybe been the best and most consistent performing player at this tournament. I think that there is a very real argument for that. He really has just been great at MSI. Not really a lot of negatives. He's a very aggressive player. He's not going to wait for the game to come to him. He's going to try and push the tempo of the game forward, and I think that's really good, especially going up against LCK, LCK teams. I think that's a style that is generally going to work better against LCK teams than just hoping and praying that you're able to kind of win in the late game team fights, because they are the best in the world at that style. So Tarzan, I think, is definitely the first player that you kind of have to point out, but pretty much all of AL is in good form right now. Flandre was excellent domestically. He's been so much better than he was last year, specifically on tanks. The moment he can, like, really get into these 5v5 team fights and start to make a difference as Peel, as frontline, whatever, as engage, it doesn't really matter. He's been excellent in a lot of those roles. Shanks has been great in a lot of different situations. I think he's really kind of come into his own as a facilitator in the mid lane, which is not something that I think we thought about for Shanks for a long time. It's kind of been the reason that I think he's finally been able to elevate himself up to the top of the LoL esports world, because previously this was an Akali Sylas player, you know, built in the Zeka mold, wanted to be a lot more of a carry in the mid lane, but I think the moment he started picking up things like Annie and Galio and being a lot more efficient on those champions, I think that's when he really started to find a ton of success, because now it's really difficult to actually prepare for what AL want to pick in draft. Hope and KL have been excellent. KL has been unreal across this year. He's not been quite as dominant, I would say, at this tournament in particular, but still been very good, and Hope honestly was great against BLG. This bot lane felt like they really got back into form in that crushing win over BLG, so I think that's the advantage for anyone's Legend, is I would argue their form is better, but for T1, you can argue their raw talent level is definitely better, and I think that that is a very fair thing to say, and it's not like T1 is out of form, specifically at MSI. This team has finally been able to figure things out. Big shocker, T1 ends up, you know, coasting through the regular season and the domestic play, and then ends up showing up internationally. Is anyone really surprised? Like, the script writers are so lazy at this point. There's really nothing else to say. This happens every single year, and at this point it's just so predictable. And you know, depending on how things go at this tournament, I can't wait to throw up a clip from the primer video I did at the beginning of this tournament, where I put T1 fourth in my power rankings and literally started off the segment by saying, well, congratulations, T1 fans. Every single time I put them below second in an international tournament, they've won it. So, you know, congratulations. I feel like I've reverse cursed T1 once more to be really successful here. But jokes aside, they're very clearly one of the top 3 teams at this tournament. They do have some negatives. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like this team is perfect. I think that their late game decision making can sometimes be a little bit too over analytical. They can sometimes, you know, overthink problems and get themselves into positions that they don't need to be in when they can just wallet check people. I think that's always been a bit of a problem with T1, is that when they're super far ahead, sometimes they try to get a little bit too cute, because they really do like those like weird, you know, Realm War 5 people into Baron plays that they like to go for. They like to make it as flashy as possible, but sometimes, you know, you don't need the flashy play. That's really the biggest negative I can give T1 at this tournament. Faker has the most isolated deaths of any player at the entire tournament. Totally fine. Honestly, the way he's been playing, it's kind of been justified. Teams continuously put a lot of pressure and time into trying to take Faker out, because he is always so far forward, and oftentimes T1 is very good at counter mapping and getting things elsewhere, and so it doesn't end up being an issue. That being said, that's matchup-wise something that I think AL can take advantage of. Tarzan actually has the highest jungle proximity to mid lane of any jungler at this entire tournament, and Faker, obviously, like I said, has the most isolated deaths of any mid laner. If that's an avenue for AL to be able to generate an advantage, that's something I could see. Outside of that, Doran needs to have a big series. Flandre has been very consistent on the top side of the map, especially as a tank player. If Doran can actually not only take advantage of that in lane, but also, you know, be more useful in team fights, kind of like he has been at this tournament, I think that that is a big boon for T1. Owner versus Tarzan is really the matchup to watch in terms of how this goes down. If one of them is going to be able to get consistent leads in the early game against the other, I think that's likely the team that will win the series. And Guma and Carry have been awesome at this tournament. They've gotten better and better every single game across this year. I would argue they started off very weak. They got really strong in the road to MSI, the domestic playoffs, whatever you want to call it, and they've been great at this tournament. And so if they continue on that upward trajectory, they should be the better bot lane here as well. And that means for T1, all you really have to do is just make sure you're in a comfortable position. I think you're more comfortable playing slow, and I think you're more comfortable playing for team fights. But I think what AL can do at a really high level is push the tempo of games and make things very quick. T1 might have to adapt in terms of their drafts in that regard. So we'll see how this goes. There's a lot to talk about, a lot to preview, but the only way really to know how this is going to go is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and this is a big way to start the series. I know I haven't really said it a lot throughout this tournament, but something I used to say a lot on this channel was game 1 and game 3 are the two most important games of the series. Obviously, every subsequent game is the game of the series, right? Like, that's just how it goes. You get more important as you go along. Game 2 becomes more relevant if you're down 0-1 or if you're up 1-0, yada yada. But in terms of, like, just mathematically speaking, game 1, getting that game 1 victory, going up 1-0, only having to win 50% of the last 4 games, it's a big advantage, and it's shown to be a pretty big deal in a lot of these international best of 5. Same thing for game 3, but AL being able to get out to a big lead in a game that, quite frankly, they just executed better in, I think is really impressive. T1 had a couple of moments in this one. I don't think their draft is really all that bad. I think it was really just a situation where they weren't able to actually get onto the hyper carry in the backline, and Hope was the best player on the Rift, and that meant that Anyone's Legend was going to be able to walk out with a victory. There were a lot of things in the middle that I think you could talk about, but really, this is a pretty simplistic game to try and go over from an analytical perspective. AL just had better team fighting, and that's why they won the game. So let's go ahead and talk about it. If you're new here, we start with draft, and then we kind of get into how that draft actually affected gameplay. For drafts, I actually think both of these teams kind of do similar things. I think generally speaking, you're looking at an Anyone's Legend comp that, spikes quite a lot in the mid game and then tries to play through Kai'Sa the later the game goes. You have a ton of engage on AL. I would say even more so than on T1, at least direct engage. I know people look at Vi, Galio, Nautilus, and you talk about like, oh, that's a ton of engage. That's a ton of frontline engage. But I think AL have a ton of ways to actually disrupt a lot of different areas because Rel Wukong is just very difficult to deal with, and you have that backline access with something like Annie if she is able to get into a good position. So I like AL's like front to back a little bit better. I think it's a tad bit more consistent, especially because you have that Kai'Sa rather than having to rely on Gwen damage coming in from Doran, which I just think makes things a little bit easier. But T1 have a ton of pick potential, so I'm not going to sit here and disparage their draft. I actually think, in isolation, you could maybe even argue that T1 had the better draft, and that's mostly because of the Galio in the mid lane. I think not only is it Faker's Galio, it's one of his signature picks of all time, but it's also one of those things that is going to be really difficult to actually match for Anyone's Legend in this game. It should have lane prio early on because Annie can't do anything into Galio. It's basically an impossible matchup for Shanks 1v1. Shanks' goal this game is to get out on the map and try and help the Wukong, but for Faker, he can basically match any play that AL want to try to make in the mid game where they want to power spike around this Annie Wukong duo, and Vi obviously can help in that regard as well. So even if they don't have quite as much damage, in my opinion, going into the late game, or at least not as consistent of a front to back, I think their ability to find picks and at least react to the rest of the map should be easier for them than it is for AL on the other side. But all of that goes out the window if Kai'Sa gets super fed. Like, that's really the big difference maker here for AL, and that's exactly what happened. Hope is player of the game. He played incredible in these fights, front to back. Like, I think sometimes I give player of the game to the AD carry because they were the one with all the resources, and, they kind of got played for, and you can talk about how they were the most important, but maybe not the most gameplay efficient, characters or players in the game because you're looking at them just kind of doing their job. Hope did way more than his job this game. His positioning was absolutely incredible. There were times where fights were actually getting trolled a little bit by Anyone's Legend, specifically KL and Tarzan, who were a little bit too far forward in terms of their engages, at times getting caught out, especially around 15-ish minutes into the game. Hope was able to pull all of that back, and most of it was around this Otacon fight that ended up happening. Really great stuff from Hope. If you go back and rewatch that fight, there were a couple of big mistakes made by both Tarzan and KL in that fight, but Hope just was so much damage, and he was so consistent in terms of keeping himself alive in a lot of those exchanges that he got himself super fed. And then we get into that Baron fight that everyone remembers at the end of the game, where basically this full combo from T1 where they Vi ult, Nautilus hook, Galio ult right on top of this Kai'Sa to perma CC her, only gets her down to 50% HP because at that point she's just too strong and they don't have enough damage to actually kill her, and then Hope completely takes over the fight. Really awesome game in game number 1 from Hope. If he's going to play like this throughout the entire series, it's going to kind of be doomed for T1. I don't really see a lot of ways for T1 to be able to win if Hope is going to be the best player in these team fights. I'm not expecting that to be the most consistent. I think T1's going to have more resources to actually be able to deal with things like that in later games, and obviously things like Kai'Sa are now off the board, but this was definitely an LPL Kai'Sa game, and I think that's a big positive. I mean that in the most respectful way possible. Shanks was fine in this game. I think he was the other player who just kind of consistently made made good plays. This is kind of a tough matchup for Annie, I think underratedly so, because it's just really difficult for her to do anything in the mid game with Galio. If she wants to move around with Wukong, Galio can show up with the ultimate, and if she wants to just try to play for laning phase, like what is Annie going to do into Galio? Like how is that ever going to be something that she can play through? So this is kind of an underratedly difficult game, I think, for Annie, but Shanks is very good at finding angles on this champion. It's one of the champs that I really like seeing him on throughout a lot of this split, because I do think this team functions better when he is a playmaker like that, and he was good in this game. I think he did a lot of nice things. Like I said, Tarzan, KL, way too far forward at times, but the good engages were incredible, especially from KL. Flandra was fine on the top side as well, didn't really have to do all that much on the Jace, but, you know, we got a win off of a tank, which is usually a good sign for AL. So overall, just nice game from them. Sub 27-minute victory against T1 in game 1 is always a very good sign. And for T1 on the other side, really just not a lot to like criticize or love about this game. This is just one of those games where you draft this pick comp through Vi and you want to try to play through the mid game, and you hope and pray that you're going to have enough damage to be able to break through in the back end of the game and actually be able to finish things off. Either that or you have this gigantic gold lead, obviously. And so for T1, you end up landing in this spot where you don't get this big lead in the early game. Faker's actually not really all that useful in terms of playing around mid game power spikes with the Vi and with the Nautilus and trying to play through a lot of creative picks in the mid game. And you get to these 5v5 team fights, the place where T1 is supposed to be better. And while you do have quote-unquote backline access, you don't really have a lot of backline threat outside of the Gwen. And so you end up in this spot where Kai'Sa just has free reign to fight. And the moment you lose Otacon and give that Kai'Sa, I believe, a triple or a quadra, like something like that, a ton of gold in that fight, and you give over Otacon to anyone's legend, the game is a little bit doomed from that point. Even the Baron fight, which is executed relatively well from T1, there's just not a lot to do. Doran ends up being in a really bad spot, specifically in that Otacon fight, and this Gwen is really important towards this comp. She's kind of the late game carry for this team, outside of maybe Gumayushi on the Jhin, who I think theoretically could actually just win some of these team fights. You need more damage setup to allow the Jhin to actually be able to finish off a lot of these targets, and Doran not being useful in this game I think was the biggest problem, so he's going to get dead of the game for me. I do also think you could realistically give this to Owner in the jungle, who really was out-jungled by Tarzan in terms of pressure. This Vi was not useful. Vi is a champion that's been super unsuccessful at this tournament. Maybe not super, but definitely unsuccessful at this tournament. Added onto the pile with Kalista and Twisted Fate and, you know, a lot of these other champions that just seem to be completely bait picks at the tournament at the current moment. But the Vi did not work here from Owner. And again, I talked about it. If one of these junglers was just going to be better than the other, at least in this series, that's probably Raps. That's probably just how things are going to go. That team will likely win, and that was the case for Tarzan in game number 1, even if he himself was not perfect. Not really a ton to say about how Faker, Guma, and Keria played this. They tried their best to follow up on some of the engages, but again, by the time that their champions became relevant, and by the time they could do anything in these team fights in the later part of the game, it was kind of already over. Kai'Sa had too much gold. So for T1, you got to be able to rebound in game number 2. This just really felt like a game where you weren't as good as anyone's legend. I doubt that that's going to be the case for the entirety of the series. AL is good, but they're not like unbelievably, you know, good. They're not unbeatable, but if they can go out to a 2-0 lead, and if they do come out and just kind of show that they can team fight better than T1, that's a big problem for T1. So big game 2 for both of these teams. Who's going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up the series at 1 apiece, and we are looking like we're going to have a pretty fun series on our hands between these two teams, because both of them have had times in the spotlight through the first 2 games. Very excited to see that. This is a very T1-esque draft. Very good takeaways as well from anyone's legend. A lot of picks that they're very comfortable on here. The Ryze and the Lucian, I think, are 2 that really stand out to me as, like, you know, Shanks loves Ryze and Hope loves Lucian, and so to take those away and also get those for Faker and Guma, very big win here in game number 2. But at the end of the day, it's all about one comfort pick in this draft, and that is the Lee Sin for Owner. This is obviously his most famous champion by a large margin. Owner's Lee Sin is quite famous in the LCK, and it definitely took advantage of that strength, that early combat power in game number 2 for anyone's legend. They just never really were able to get their feet under them in this game. They kind of got blown back in the early game. The moment they started making desperation plays, I knew that this was probably over. So let's go ahead and get into draft discussion and kind of talking about where I think each team's advantages and disadvantages end up lying. I think a lot of people would expect me to say something more positive about AL's draft than I'm going to, because generally there are a lot of things here that in isolation I really like. I love Ezreal Karma as a bot lane duo. I really think that it's arguably the strongest bot lane in the game right now, just in terms of how things are going. Varus plus anybody is probably the strongest bot lane in the game, but Ezreal Karma's really, really good. I think it's a lot better than people are giving it credit for. I think we've seen multiple teams at the tournament really benefit from understanding how that bot lane functions. I'm a big fan of Orianna. I think the consistency that that champion offers you is just really high, and obviously taking that away from Faker, who's had a ton of success on it throughout his entire career, but specifically at this tournament, is really big. I think getting Flandra on his Yorick is really positive. Tarzan on Trundle, one of his better champions, I think is really positive. In isolation, I think it's okay to like anyone's Legends draft and to say that they have more options, but what I don't really like is you're not really in a position where you win at any major point in the game. Like, T1's comp is going to fall off really hard in the late game. It's Renekton, Lee Sin, Lucian. You're not going to have a ton of damage. Ryze is basically being counted upon to be your #1 damage dealer in the back half of the game, and that's a really inconsistent thing to do if Lucian's not really fed, which obviously can happen. Their early game is incredibly good here. I just typically don't like indexing super heavily into these comps that need to win early. I think we've seen at this tournament that can struggle. The negative, I think, for AL in this case is that I actually don't think that they guarantee, like, dominate late. I don't think they have this comp that, like, guarantees themselves teamfight wins. Like, Ezreal can be in a spot where he can do that, but Braum is a really good counter to Ezreal. This is one of the lanes that I think you don't really draft Ezreal Karma into. Orianna is going to be asked to do a lot of the heavy lifting, and I think she's much more comfortable being a secondary carry in the late game. This Yorick is going to be in a tough spot because he's not going to win early. He's not really going to have resources going into Renekton, Lee Sin on the other side of this matchup, and so for all of those positives that I think AL has in terms of the way that they built their comp, I just don't necessarily think that, it's good specifically in this matchup. I think T1's comp isn't great either, but at least they're comfortable on it, and they have a huge advantage in the early game where they should just be able to take their lead, and that's exactly what they did. This was an owner Lee Sin game. He is going to get player of the game. You don't really need me to explain to you why he's getting player of the game. This guy ran the entirety of the early game. A lot of his aggressive decisions early really put AL in a hole, and like I said, it kind of forced them into a lot of desperation plays pretty quickly. That 15-minute dive on the bot lane was basically where the game was entirely out of control. Owner had generated such a large lead for himself and for his teammates, specifically Doran and Gumayushi, by that point, that it was really difficult for AL to find their way back in. And when you get these big, long, drawn-out skirmishes, even in the mid-game, with something like Renekton and Lee Sin, they can really take advantage of that because of their ability to just kind of survive in a lot of these fights, especially with gold when they have an advantage. So credit to Owner. The Lee Sin didn't quite work out against Genji, although it kind of did. He just inted away the back half of that game. It was really good in the early game. It just didn't quite work in the end. It definitely worked here against anyone's Legend, and that's a good sign for T1 fans. Again, Doran and Gumayushi were incredibly strong in this game. Doran had a lot of attention coming in from Owner, so I'm not going to give him as much credit as maybe I'm going to give Guma, who basically got his lead on his own for the most part. This is a really good laning phase from Lucian. I don't actually love this early laning phase for Lucian because I do think it can be difficult to ever really punish like Karma Ezreal because you have to put yourself in danger to ever step up and try to fight, but Guma ended up getting super fed from a lot of these exchanges, these like skirmishes that ended up going down either on the bot side or around a lot of these neutral objectives, and by the time you hit, Otacon or Dragon, like this culling is actually going to completely break through the entire front line. So credit to Guma. I think he was probably the second best player in this game. Carrier was solid on the Braum. No real negatives. Braum's in a great spot this game to actually just be able to win. So much, quote-unquote poke coming in on the other side from this Ezreal Karma lane that Braum can just kind of negate by pressing E. Always a very big positive there. The big worry is that obviously Trundle has a pretty decent target to steal stats from in the Braum, but, it didn't really end up mattering in the end. It was never really going to be a game after the early game. So I think Owner, Carrier, Gumayushi, definitely the standouts. Doran got a lot of attention. It ended up getting really fed. Flandra was on the back foot the entire game because of the lack of protection coming in from Tarzan. Faker was there too, credit to him. He did fine. He had some nice, escapes as he always does on Ryze in terms of realm warping himself out of danger, but this was really an Owner Lee Sin game where he got the Lucian fed, and that was probably what they should have done in the first place. And then for anyone's Legend on the other side, they just kind of got beat. Like, I think this is worse than game one for me in terms of like, you just lost. Like, this is kind of a tilting game because I don't think AL did anything particularly awful awful. I don't think their draft is all that good in this particular context, but I don't think it's bad either. I think, again, Ezreal Karma can do a lot in the mid-game fights. I think things like Orianna can really take over games. You know, you got Flandra on Yorick, where he's arguably been at his most successful from an aggressive standpoint. You know, Tarzan as well on Trundle. Like, you have a lot of tools to be able to play this game out. The problem is that AL kind of ran into this issue where T1 was making a ton of plays early, and they didn't have any sort of counterpunch to make. They end up going for, like I say, desperation plays on the bottom side of the map, especially that dive on bot side that ends up turning into a big skirmish, a big kerfuffle, if you will, and they're just getting outplayed by T1. There's really not even a lot of negatives to say about AL. This is basically exactly what happened in their series against Gen G, where it felt like they were making the right plays, they were just losing anyways, and so it just kind of is what it is. If that's going to be the case, if mechanically speaking they're just going to get skill checked by T1, or especially wallet checked at the end of this game after a really good early game from T1, like that's just how it is. T1 had full control of the pace of the game here because they picked Lee Sin, Renekton, Lucian, and they took full advantage of it. So nice game 2 from T1. They tie up the series, but now, as you guys know, we get into what is, in my opinion, the most important game of the series, game number 3, which is of course going to dictate everything that we see for the rest of this series. Going up 2-1 is a gigantic advantage in a series like this. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1, and they looked incredible in game 3. I would argue that this was the best game of the series from a winning side. T1's game 2 was really great, and I really want to say that. This game honestly reminded me a lot of game number 2 of this series, where one team just gets so many early advantages and plays the map so well that the other team, you know, being down in gold and not really being able to play is almost entirely not their fault. There's just nothing they can do at that point to be able to get themselves back in. I think that's a really nice takeaway to have, not just for AL and for T1 in game 2, but for, you know, this series as a whole, that both of these teams have kind of proven that they're world-class level at specific things and at specific points. This was a great win for AL, and really, I mean, one player has just completely flipped the already bogus narrative that they already had for many years and kind of become a true legend that almost anyone can appreciate. Ha ha ha. But obviously, jokes aside, this was a great game for AL, and for T1, they just didn't have the pressure to actually be able to compete with what Anyone's Legend was outputting here. They got super far down in the early game. A couple of bad plays ended up going, you know, in favor of AL for them, and they just never really were able to recover. AL never gave them an opportunity to recover. This was nearly a perfect game coming in from them. So let's go ahead and talk about draft. Ironically enough, this is really not a draft gap from AL, at least from my perspective. I came out of this draft feeling very confident that T1 was going to win the game, that they had basically everything they needed in order to win the game, that this was just a better draft from them in almost every capacity. You're looking at super good engage in the back half of the game coming in from Nico and from Jarvan and from Ornn and from the Wombo combos that can go down if you do trap people in your ultimates. And I think the most encouraging thing for me is you're looking at 3 lanes that honestly should be in a great spot in the early game. I think Aurora should have a ton of priority into the Victor. As much as Victor is just going to inherently outscale Aurora, it's going to be difficult for Aurora, or for Victor in my opinion, to be able to actually push and move alongside the Xin Zhao to allow him to play as aggressively as he's going to want to do. The Rumble's certainly not going to be able to dominate the Ornn on the top side. Ornn's going to be able to stall out that laning phase relatively efficiently and then turn that into good team fighting in the late game. You've got things like Varus that are obviously incredibly strong, but Misfortune should be able to actually control this lane alongside the Nico in the early game, even if Varus is going to have more, you know, combat power in the mid game. You know, these are a lot of things that I think end up favoring T1 just from an individual perspective in this matchup, but AL, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered for them in terms of their draft was first and foremost that they had damage in the late game to guarantee that they could go out there and team fight, and also that Tarzan was here, because that was the difference maker. That's what changed this game for everyone involved, was Tarzan, who's player of the game in game 3. Look, I'm going to go on a bit of a rant here because I think it's deserved and I think it's earned, and I used to go on a lot of these rants all the time, especially domestically, but at this point, I just have to go out and, you know, just kind of talk about how stupid people were for so long when it came to this player. Tarzan gained this reputation of being an international underperformer, and I'm going to be entirely frank with you. I don't think there is a single Tarzan team that has ever underperformed internationally. Maybe you can talk about Griffin, right? Like, maybe you can talk about 2019 Griffin. I think that there is some sort of of argument to make there, but even then, that wasn't really that bad of a tournament for Griffin at 2019 Worlds. And then you're looking at everything Tarzan did after that. He ends up going to Worlds on an LNG team that has basically no one else around him to actually be able to do anything. Icon was his mid laner. Shout out Icon. I do like Icon as a player, but are we, actually trying to believe that Rookie Light and a very young Ala were like good enough to actually be able to carry that team to Worlds at that time, one of the strongest periods of the LPL ever? That's a crazy thing to say. Tarzan was a huge part of why that team found any sort of success. And then you're looking at, oh, did he underperform with Doingby? Yeah, go watch that team, man. It was super inconsistent to be able to play through both of them. Their styles just did not mix. They did not play well off of each other. Both of them kind of wanted to play for each other, and that meant that nobody was really good at getting those resources. But he ends up joining LNG with Scout, ends up becoming the or I guess like Scout ends up joining LNG, and they end up, playing around that. He becomes the scapegoat for a team that is generally fine, like gets top 8 at Worlds and loses to T1 in round 1. Okay, whatever, like that's fine. That's a totally fine result for the LPL 3rd seed from my perspective. And then he gets cut from that team because he is the scapegoat. He ends up going to Weibo Gaming. He drags that team to the semifinals of Worlds. Yeah, it's sure international underperformer getting a team that got 4th in the LPL, barely ended up making Worlds in the first place, got them to top 4 at the entire tournament. That sure seems like an underperformance to me. And then of course this year, he's dragging this team as well as the #1 team to a 2-1 series lead in the semifinals over T1. Regardless of what happens in this series, I hope everyone who talked about Tarzan's international woes is just silenced by this point. We got to be done with this conversation that was bogus to begin with. It's bogus now. It's ridiculous that I even have to talk about this. It's not, I saw this comment, and this is really what spurred this. I saw a comment that was like, Tabe saved Tarzan's international career. And it's like, I'm serious. You just have to be delusional. Like you just have to be delusional to have that kind of take or to believe that under any context. Tarzan is one of the greatest junglers of all time. He is starting to really come into his prime. I would argue this is the best year of his career up until this point, and you know what? Like, that's insane to say because he's had some incredible years. If you think Tabe saved Tarzan, like, I'm not trying to take anything away from Tabe, but, like, if you genuinely think that Tabe is the reason that Tarzan is relevant on the international stage, I think we just have to agree that we are never going to be on the same page when it comes to analysis because Tarzan is just ridiculous. This is an A+++ type of game from him. He instantly won it for anyone's legend. You cannot give him Xin Zhao. There's no way for T1 to be able to play this out. I understand that there is this argument that, like, oh, T1 lost draft because there's no way to actually punish the Xin Zhao. There are plenty of ways to punish the Xin Zhao from my perspective, as long as he's not able to completely run the game early, because he's not actually going to do that much damage in these fights in the late game. So whether or not you can kill him or not is irrelevant if you can actually get on priority targets. But T1 didn't allow, that to happen. Xin Zhao got super fed because Tarzan played perfect and he kept being really aggressive, and it ended up just being unplayable for T1. Obviously, credit to the rest of the team. Shanks had a couple of big fights, also misstepped at times, but was generally very positive. I think KL had a pretty solid game. Fondra picked the Rumble in the jungle skin, which is reportable, but at the end of the day, AL was better, and a lot of it was thanks to their star jungler. And then for T1 on the other side, like, I honestly don't even want to blame them. In the same way that I didn't want to blame AL for game number 2, AL played excellently at the start of this game, and T1 just really had no avenue to get themselves back into it. The moment Tarzan went for that big skirmish in the middle of bot tier 1 and bot tier 2 right before Otacon, the game was over. There was no way to play it out from that point. You can talk about some positives and some negatives, but for the most part, I just don't think there's a lot to reference here. Doran's dead of the game, but, like, wasn't really Doran's fault that he couldn't do anything. He's playing a tank and the entire team is behind in gold. Like, the Ornn was just kind of useless. Keria didn't end up getting any sort of actual ultimates off this game on the Nico because he was getting bursted down before any fight started. Tarzan was literally just completely obliterating him the moment that things ended up happening. Gumayushi had a couple of nice angles for bullet times, but again, like, the Xin Zhao ult blocks a lot of it, and that just ended up being a big problem. Owner could never get in. Faker actually was quite bad on the Aurora. The scoreline doesn't really indicate that. I'm not going to sit here and lambast him for that. It's a hard game to play of Aurora, but T1 was not as good as anyone's legend again, and now they're down 1-2. AL just have to win one of the games left in this series, either Game 4 or Game 5. I'm sure they'd love to close this out in Game 4, not risk going to a Game 5 against the most clutch team of all time, but T1 probably really want to lock in now. Game 4 is a big one. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of Game number 4 was T1, they are going to take game number 4. They're going to even up the series once more at 2 apiece this time. And yet again, we are being pushed to yet another Silver Scrapes game number 5 between teams at this tournament. This will be T1's third game 5 at this tournament already. Anyone's Legend obviously has not had quite that difficult of a road. This will only be their second game number 5, but they've also played more series than T1. Both of these teams have gotten to play quite a lot of games at this international tournament from an on-stage perspective, which is obviously a huge plus to their development, but T1 really fighting back. Anyone's Legend had some opportunities in this game to be able to pull things into their direction. I think their draft is generally pretty safe and pretty good. I think generally it's kind of what they look for in terms of how they want to play the game, but T1 had a couple of things up their sleeve as well in terms of comfort picks, and theirs were just a little bit more successful, especially in the mid game. So let's go ahead and get into the conversation here, starting of course with draft. This is the first time I think one team just had an inherent advantage in draft. I think T1 just outdrafted AL here in game number 4. I think it's much easier for them to be able to execute on the things that they ended up drafting. I want to give AL some grace for it because I do think it's a lot of comfort for them. I think things like Maokai Silas as a mid-jungle duo are right up the alley in terms of how they like to play the game. Hope has been pretty successful on Senna, and Senna in general has been very good at this tournament, and so I get going for that Flandra on something like the Mbessa obviously makes a lot of sense, but I'm just a little confused as to where exactly they're supposed to be winning. At any point in this game, Mbessa is going to be able to generate some leads as long as she's not completely taken out of the game in a side lane. Spoiler alert, the lane swaps end up really punishing the top laners in this game. That heavily favors T1 as things continue to go along, but outside of that, T1 just kind of have the lowdown on the draft that they wanted to go for, and they executed on it better. I think the moment that they flexed Corki into the mid lane, things got very difficult for AL. Corki is a notoriously good matchup into Silas in the mid lane because it's very difficult for Silas to actually get on him in the first place with the safety that Corki has with the Valkyrie, and he has a horrible ultimate to steal that you can't really punish at any point in the mid game, and so it's just a little bit more of a difficult matchup for Shanks in general. Faker obviously has played a ton of Corki over the course of his career, and I also think it's really easy to say that, like, even if this game stalls out and goes nowhere and you play for the Maokai Senna win condition, like, Xayah, Corki, Lilia, Jax is, like, stronger in the late game than Anyone's Legend. I think AL are honestly on a clock in terms of how this game is set up, which you don't necessarily feel with the way that they ended up drafting, but it kind of becomes reality with the comp that T1 ended up countering with, and I think T1 in general just kind of mega draft gapped Anyone's Legend in this game. I know that that seems to be an unpopular opinion. I think I saw multiple people online saying something else, but I don't know. I'm just going to share my opinion. I find it very difficult to imagine a world where AL without a gigantic gold lead ever wins this game, and that was kind of the case. T1 was neutral for a majority of this game and then ended up really spiraling things out of control. Great Herald fight from them. Shanks ends up trying to go for this flank play from the top side of the fight, and immediately T1 just completely turn on him, pull him down, and that's a small gold lead in favor of T1, but after that, things really break open at a bot fight where AL basically full engage on this Jax to try and kill him. He ends up being able to survive. They use 3 ultimates to attempt to lock him down and, you know, take him out before this Otacon fight ends up starting, and it doesn't work. He's able to jump out, obviously survive. He backs, he buys Seeker's arm guard, he teleports back in, immediately gets onto the backline, and just insta wins the fight for the team. Owner was incredible throughout the rest of this game, though, so Owner is going to be the one who gets player of the game for me, even if I do think that Doran probably made the biggest play in that Otacon fight. Doran was also almost completely taken out of the early game because of the just general way that both of these teams played. They lane swapped their top laners into bad positions where they couldn't really generate a ton of gold, and that meant that Doran really wasn't going to be the one to take over. Owner kind of had to be the one to step up. I think a lot of people are going to look at basically his 4-man sleep at the end of the game, basically around that final dragon, that soul point where he just completely eviscerated Anyone's Legend and insta lost the game for them. But even before that, his tempo was really solid. Tarzan did a decent job of trying to keep up with him in terms of what he was doing in the early game, but it's just really hard to keep up with Lilia, and if that's your goal, it's going to be a pretty difficult thing to accomplish. It really did feel like AL felt comfortable going neutral in the early game, which I just don't agree with personally. I know people are going to disagree with that here, but I really just think T1 was always going to be in a great spot going into the back half of this game, and I think we kind of saw why. Owner played very patient, was very good at making sure he was in the right position to secure objectives alongside Gumayushi. Some early smites, but it's fine. Guma had him bailed out in a couple of really really nice instances, but Owner generally had a great game, and I think he deserves that player of the game. Doran, though, of course, has to be shout out because, again, he had the biggest play of the game, that, surviving that 3v1 gank attempt on the bottom side right before Otacon, and then being able to teleport back in and be the biggest influence in that team fight. Ginormous stuff. He has been super clutch in the back half of these series. Doran's always been clutch domestically in a lot of these best of fives. It's awesome that we finally get to see that version of him come out internationally as well, now that he's got the T1 buff alongside the rest of this team. Faker was really solid on Corki. I love this pick. I know I'm really anti-Corki, but this is an awesome Corki mid angle in terms of just the setups. Not only obviously is it great into Sylas, but it's really hard to punish Corki as Maokai on the other side. It's going to be difficult for Maokai to ever make sure that Corki can't get into a position where he can just start free firing in the back end here. Guma's the best objective securer in the world, despite the fact that he's an AD carry. Carry had a couple of nice engages. For the most part, he wasn't all that relevant, mostly just was kind of there to protect the backline, but T1 ended up playing better, and that's why they ended up walking out here, especially through the draft that I think was really smart. And then for AL on the other side, they just got outplayed in the mid-game fights. Shanks ends up being my dud of the game because he just played way too hard, way too fast. Shanks' Sylas is feared in the LPL, and it felt like that was going to be the case when he started 1v2ing on the bottom side of some of these fights. But, he was just too far forward, oftentimes completely disconnected from the rest of his team. Felt like he was looking for these big flank engage angles that he could find domestically, and T1 was just being way more calculated about making sure that the Sylas wasn't going to break the backline of that team. And unfortunately for Shanks, he didn't really have a second gear. He ended up being pretty useless throughout this game, and again, getting caught out way too far forward in a couple of big circumstances. I also think that KL wasn't perfect in this game, but what are you supposed to do on the Tahm Kench? Sometimes he was a bit over eager and over aggressive in looking for engages throughout the map. Sometimes they were good, sometimes they were not. It is what it is. Flandra had some incredible ults, didn't really matter. Tarzan was very slow on using Maokai ult, was often 1 or 2 seconds behind the play, which is never great, but outside of that, he was totally fine. Hope was doing damage in these fights, but T1 just ended up playing it better. I'm not going to sit here and say that AL completely threw the game away. Shanks was the only one making game-losing errors, but at the end of the day, T1 certainly executed better, and I think they were set up better in this game, and it was close. It was neutral. I know it was a sub 27-minute victory, but we were looking at 20 minutes, a 500 gold deficit, for anyone's legend. This was not an unwinnable game for them, and it just didn't end up working out, but this is a really big win for T1, obviously keeping their series alive and pushing yet another game number 5. They are game 5 merchants. The entirety of the LCK is game 5 merchants at this point. Can they live up to that title, or will anyone's legend prove that their streak of being able to win the odd numbered games in this series is real, and that the LPL deserves to be considered right up there with the LCK as they were for many years? Well, the winner of game number 5 was T1. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2. And they are going to be moving on to a date with Destiny. For the first time ever, we are getting Chovy versus Faker in an international final. That is incredibly exciting, but of course, we have to talk about Game 5 before we get into anything else when it comes to this tournament. Anyone's Legend tried their absolute best to build a Jinx destruction comp here in Game 5, clearly allowing T1 to go in that direction, understanding that Guma was going to go for something like that. And unfortunately for them, their Jinx destruction comp just did not end up working out. The Jinx got mega fed, T1 ended up outplaying AL in pretty much every conceivable way, and they end up walking their way to a series victory. I have some words to say about this AL draft because I do think it's good in isolation, right? I want to talk about why I think this is defendable, why I think this is understandable, even in terms of why they drafted it. It really just comes down to one pick for me that ends up, being the big question mark on the priority. But again, you guys already know what it is, and we're going to talk about it. We're getting into draft. Let's go ahead and get into it. T1 is all in on scaling on the Jinx win condition, on playing front to back around Jinx and around Hui as your 2 big damage dealers in these fights. You have playmaking tools. You have Alistar, you have Skarner, you have Gragas, which obviously is a playmaker in the hands of someone like Doran, but at the same time, you really want to make sure that this bot lane is in a great spot, because if Jinx doesn't have gold, it's going to be very difficult. And anyone's Legend, they saw this in draft and they said, okay, well, we're going to put everything we have in our draft into making sure Jinx has as hard of a time as possible in winning this game. And I understand it. I think it ends up really working out for them. They've got this comp that honestly should destroy the early game here. Their early game is 100x better than T1. In fact, I would say most of these lanes are dominating wins for anyone's Legend, mostly because I think Olaf is going to be in a very difficult position to stop throughout a lot of this early game. Ziggs can obviously push in and start to really pressure at the Jinx, not really allow her to generate a lot of resources. You have Twisted Fate, who should be pushing in. The Hwei and moving around the map. That did not happen, which obviously we will talk about. You have Aatrox on the top side of this map, which I always think is a good matchup into Gragas because Aatrox's laning is severely underrated. I think he's one of the best 1v1 like laning top laners in the game right now. You have Poppy to be able to shut down the Alistar engages and the Skarner engages throughout a lot of this game. Olaf again just kind of runs down Hwei and Jinx and these low mobility carries by the end of the game if you have any gold. The problem with all of this is it relies on you winning. You have to win early. You have to actually generate the gold and you have to actually be able to win your lanes and push your advantages, and that's not something that AL was capable of doing. In game number 5 here, T1 draft a comp that all they need to do is survive, and yet they end up thriving in the early game. They're the ones making the proactive plays. They're the ones winning a lot of the early game skirmishes, and from that point, it's legitimately unplayable for anyone's Legend because they are entirely, focused on trying to play the early game here and snowballing the game out of control, which just didn't happen. Really frustrating stuff from AL in terms of execution, but for T1, really easy to talk about the positives because boy were there a lot in this game. Player of the game is so obvious to me, it's gotta go to Keria. This was an unbelievable, again, A++ type of Keria Alistar performance. First off, how is this guy getting Alistar in game 5 of Fearless? How are we allowing that to happen? I understand that for some reason teams have been mind controlled into thinking that Twisted Fate is a must play throughout a lot of these games, and obviously Twisted Fate 0-8 at this tournament, completely a liability in basically every game he's been played in. It's not just, oh, he's not winning in the same way that, Kallista's not winning, and, there are some games where Kallista's looked good, some where Kallista's looked bad. She's not been able to win in any of them. I would argue Twisted Fate was the worst champion at this tournament because in almost every single game that he's picked in, he is the reason that his team is losing. I just don't understand what the possible reason for picking it in a do-or-die game 5 in the semifinals of MSI is. It's just a complete, brain, lack of thought, in my opinion. This is an insta-loss kind of game the moment you pick Twisted Fate B1. From my perspective, with just how weak this champion clearly is in terms of his damage output. That being said, you still had to go out there and execute. Keria was incredible. The amount of times that someone got headbutt immediately into range of Jinx, who just completely killed them, is insane. It's actually astounding how good Keria was throughout this game and how creative he was in terms of his engage angles. We know Keria is a very clutch performer. This just solidified it. People are going to give Guma a lot of credit as well. Guma had the easiest job of all time in this game, which was to sit there and let his entire team set up kill after kill after kill for him. I'm not criticizing Gumayushi for that. I certainly don't want it to come across like I'm some sort of Guma hater. T1 fans will crucify me in the comment section if that becomes the case, but I don't know, man. He didn't really have to do that many crazy things this game. He kind of just got to be a super fed Jinx that could right-click throughout the entire game and win it. Credit to Keria, he did awesome at the setup, and credit to my player of the series, who is going to be Owner in the jungle. I didn't really have to think about this, especially in games 2 and 4. Owner was really the reason why they ended up winning those games, specifically the Lee Sin in game 2, but the Lilia was still great in game 4. And he was awesome on the Skarner in game number 5 here. Specifically, that ult he got onto KL around, I believe it was first dragon, second dragon, one of those two that he ended up landing onto the Poppy that interrupted the Poppy ultimate. Huge turn there from T1 that allowed them to start stacking objectives and basically got them the gold lead that they never looked back from. That's the kind of play that AL needs to make in the early game in order to win. And Owner basically completely disrupted it. So Owner, best player on the Rift today. I said it in the preview. If one of these junglers was going to be better than the other, they're probably going to win the series, and I'll talk about it. Tarzan was easily the best player on anyone's Legend here today. It just didn't matter. Owner was a little bit better, which is, big positive to T1. Doran was really solid on his signature Gragas in game 5 here. Wasn't great throughout the rest of the series, but, stepped up in games 4 and 5, and those are the games that really matter. Faker was fine in this series. He's not the main character of T1 anymore. He is more so along for the ride, and that is a very good thing for T1 because it means they have 4 stars elsewhere on their team. Keria was ridiculous. Owner was ridiculous. Guma had some incredible games. Doran was awesome in the back half of this series, and then Faker wasn't bad. I'm certainly not trying to disparage anybody on T1. It was just a really big team effort, and all of their wins were really solid. And for anyone's Legend, I mean, come on, man. What do you want me to say? This was a comp that had to win early, and they didn't win early. They started losing fights, and the game was doomed from that point. Shanks is getting dead of the game because, once again, this Twisted Fate was entirely useless. If you wanted to give this to KL, I think he's the only other player that you can kind of reasonably consider. A couple of really bad Poppy fights, just walking up into CC and instantly losing all of the pressure that he was able to generate for himself by setting up around objectives. It's really disappointing to see a player who is good at this champion fail so miserably at playing it. But how can you not give Shanks dead of the game. Like, in a do or die game number 5, you're picking Twisted Fate. Like, that's who you're resting your entire tournament on, is B1 Twisted Fate, who has yet to win a game, who has been dud of the game in almost every game that he's played. Absolutely ridiculous. Shanks deserves dud of the game for this, if just for the pick alone, but also the Twisted Fate was ass. Like, it didn't work. It wasn't good. He was dud of the game in terms of execution as well. It's just horrible stuff from anyone's Legend drafting wise, and I like the rest of this draft. I want to be clear. I like the Zigspot. I love the Poppy. I love the Olaf in terms of the way that they set themselves up. But again, once you lose that early game win condition, it's really difficult to imagine a world where you end up pulling this game back, and that was the reality. Tarzan was awesome today, and he definitely doesn't deserve to be considered the scapegoat of this team. He tried his best to win this series. I even think Hope was generally fine here today, but Shanks wasn't good enough, especially in games 4 and 5, where he was a liability in both. KL, I think, wasn't quite as good down the stretch of this entire tournament, and Flandra couldn't really do anything on the top side. AL will be going back to the LPL, unfortunately, with the knowledge that right now the LCK is king, and that's what T1 came here to prove, and that's exactly what they did. Now, we'll see which version of T1 ends up showing up in the finals. They've proven that they're from the best region. Can they prove that they still are the international GOATs? Can they take down Gen G, or are they going to be, you know, kind of put in the same position they have been against Gen G all year long up until this point? The only way to know is to see how it goes, and I, for one, am very excited to see how it goes. All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI semifinals overview and analysis video. Only one series left to talk about. It's the MSI finals here in 2025. It's Gen G taking on T1 for the billionth time. Obviously, you know, we've seen these two teams face off a couple of times. Never in an international final, though. This will be the first time that we see Chovy versus Faker in the finals of a major international tournament. I am very excited to see how that ends up breaking down, how it ends up working out. In terms of predictions, I don't know, man. It's so impossible for me to pick because Gen G is still undefeated. They are 22, 23-0 in terms of best of series so far in the spring split, but man, the T1 international buff is so incredibly strong. It's so difficult to ever, you know, bet against them in an international final. I have a feeling this is going to go to 5. I don't know what could possibly give me that assertion other than the fact that T1 and Gen G are both obsessed with going to 5 games at this tournament. They're both game 5 merchants, if you will. But for now, I have to stick to my guns. I'm going to pick Gen G very tentatively. I feel worse about Gen G winning this than I did about Gen G winning winners finals. I think if T1 was ever going to step up and win a series, it was going to be this one, but I have to stick to my gut. I have to stick to my guns and what I've seen on tape, and I have to see if Gen G can finally overcome their demons again, back-to-back, to take their second back-to-back MSI title. But let me know if you agree or disagree with that takedown in the comment section below. Always curious to know what your thoughts and opinions are there, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We're covering the MSI finals in the same format that we did today tomorrow, and I'm very excited to see how that ends up going. Of course, we're also getting back into the swing of all of the regions in just a week or so after this tournament ends. If you guys didn't know, if you just joined me for MSI, we cover the LTA, the LEC, the LCK, and the LPL every single week, every single game on this channel. So even after MSI is over, get excited for a lot of summer split content coming your way, and hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all